All right, hi everybody. Thanks for coming out to the last talk of the day. Sometimes people like to dip out before the last talk. And so I appreciate everybody coming. What we're going to do is talk about pen testing. So red and blue teams working together. Just a little bit about myself. Like I said, my name is Martin Voss. I'm a penetration tester. I work at Trusted Sec, in case you didn't see my fancy t-shirt. I also have been with the Backtrack project since almost day one and throughout the transition to Kali Linux. I don't really work on the project too much anymore, but that is basically my background comes from all of that work in penetration testing. I'm also a co-founder of DerbyCon Security Conference. Also importantly, I'm not a CISSP, so if that bothers anyone, you can leave now. And my handle on Twitter used to be Pure Hate, but I changed it due to a political sellout. I needed to be on CNN, and they wouldn't put that on there, so it's different now.
We'll get you on Fox, right?
No. I'm too liberal for Fox. So anyway, what I want to talk about is red team and blue team testing, and there's been a lot of talks over the past few years about it. I know that it's been a topic that's been heavily talked about. Sort of the difference in between what some of the other people were talking about and what I wanted to talk about is that most of the stuff that people talked about, purple teams and red and blue teams working together and stuff, was all sort of theory. That it would be really great if we could do this and, everybody could hold hands and sing Kumbaya. The reality is that very few people are actually executing these types of tests. And so me and my team have actually been executing several purple team tests over the past 2 years. And so I'm going to talk about some of the stuff that I've learned from those tests. And some of the challenges that we had, and some of the things that worked out great, and that kind of stuff. So, what's interesting about security today is that basically everywhere I go, it used to be back in the days that security companies were struggling for money, and they didn't have enough employees, and they didn't have all of this kind of stuff. But right now, it seems that we have an influx of cash in security. We got all these people getting hacked, right? So here's just a couple highlights from the last few years. We obviously know that this list would go down like 8 more screens if we wanted to. But the thing is that high-profile people are getting hacked, and C-level people in these organizations are actually starting to get worried about it. They're hiring people and they're throwing all this money at the problem, and so that type of thing is no longer an issue, right? But the problem is that we're actually still getting hacked, right? We have all these people, we got all this money, we got all this stuff, and so, I want to talk about why we're still getting hacked. So, the number one thing is this guy. Has anybody got this guy calling you all the time? So, unfortunately, and I'm not going to call out anybody in particular, but unfortunately, there's a lot of companies that are still doing penetration testing sort of in the old standard way, right? They come in, and they smash stuff up, and they get domain admin, and they generate a report with some kind of tool or something. It's got a bunch of generic recommendations in it. Like half of them don't even make any sense to your environment, and you don't know what to do with that, right? So what's happened to this situation is now that security has become more popular and got all this cash. Now what's happening is the salespeople are selling red team engagements, right? Because that sounds awesome. They do that in the military, so it must be awesome. And so you got this guy telling you that you need a red team engagement. And what they're saying is you need an adversary, you need a targeted attacker, you need somebody that, to pretend like they're from China or whatever the case may be, right? And so, that's where we enter the red team. And so this has become the hottest new term, over the past couple of years. Like I can't even places I've worked at, the salespeople have been guilty of literally calling anything that they can a red team because it sounds really sexy. So the problem with that is that, once again, all we're really doing, and 9 times out of 10 in these red team situations, is traditional goal-oriented pen testing, right? The terms in the industry have been misused a lot over the past couple of years, a lot of times you'll just get the Nessus scan, and I'm not saying scanner companies, but a lot of companies build their pen tests off the scan, right? If you hire a vendor to do your penetration test and they come in and they ask to be whitelisted and they're running Nessus and all of these scanners on day one, that's not pen testing as far as I'm concerned. That's just, conducting a security assessment based on the results of a scan, right? I'm not saying that they're just scan monkeys, because they're going in and they're validating all of those findings and they're using another tool and they're making sure that those findings are actually accurate. But that's not following the breadcrumbs of an actual attack, right? So that's not going to happen in a targeted attack. There's three ways generally that your company gets compromised on the inside. So the reason we do internal assessments is to simulate an insider threat, right? So there's a couple of different ways that can happen. One of them is from a phishing attack, so a user's computer gets compromised. So at that point, the attacker already has a set of domain credentials, and there's already a specific path of stuff that they will do with those credentials, and none of them involve Nessus and anonymous FTP and SSL-v3. I can promise you that right now, right? And so the other things that you have is somebody plugging a rogue device into your network. Now that guy's definitely starting from square one, right? He doesn't have anything, but once again, he's going to be going after network traffic. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the easy wins in a second, but he's going to be going after password hashes, network traffic. And then the third way is a disgruntled employee, and once again, that employee already has some type of access. So the problem with the red team is that they come into the organization and they think they're really awesome, and they plug into the network, and they, rip through, and they get domain admin, and they do all of this really cool stuff, and they show you these, screenshots, and they're high-fiving each other, and, everything's really great, and then they leave. And then you're basically stuck with, how did they do that, right? And so you might get a report. I've seen a lot of good reports. I've seen a lot of bad reports. In my opinion, if you can't take every single vulnerability in a report and recreate the issue, even if nobody on your team knows anything about it, then it's not technically, did I really do you any good, right? Did I really give you a recommendation that can help you? So a lot of people think that, penetration testing is this magical black art, right? And a lot of the guys that come in and are on a red team want to act like it is. It's not. I'm still using the same techniques that I've been using for the past 10 years to own organizations. Now, sometimes a new technology comes out or a new bypass or a new something, but the fundamental theories that we're using are still the same. And so the problem is that obviously there's some sort of disconnect, right? For some reason, the stuff that we're coming in pen testing is not getting fixed. So, a couple of easy wins that I normally find in organizations. Just going to go over these really quick. You can even be brave and raise your hand if you got these. But anyway, believe it or not, I don't know how many birthdays we've had for this thing at DerbyCon, but I still find this every now and then. Now we're getting better, right? Most people, but what it has taken is for 2003 to basically lose its support to get rid of this, right? There's still people with this out there. This is my favorite. Anybody run Tomcat on their network? This is basically my favorite vulnerability ever. And the reason is because I find it on every single pen test. And it's never in the production deployments. It's always in the developer deployments. So what happens is the developers spin up a box. They call IT and they're like, I need a server, I need it to be on the domain, and I need it to do this, and I need you to install Tomcat. And so, somebody does that for them. Well, they just leave all the default stuff in there because they figure the developer will handle it. Well, the developer doesn't care because he doesn't care about security. That's not his job. And so he starts to build his platform on top of there, all running on a default Tomcat application. And so for anybody that doesn't know, Tomcat basically runs as a highly privileged Java user, so it's absolutely trivial to compromise the system. Here's another Tomcat. I actually found one this old recently, so I wanted to throw it in there. Tomcat 7's pretty old. Another favorite that never goes away is Cold Fusion. Love Cold Fusion. We actually got so good with Cold Fusion that it has a pass the hash attack where you can basically log in with the user hash after you do a escape me. But anyway, the attack that brings up the hash of the admin user, and then you can log in with that hash. So we actually created a Google Chrome plugin, a couple friends of mine, and basically it pulls the hash and it just logs you right in, and you never even see it. It just happens in the background. So that's pretty fantastic. I like Cold Fusion a lot. This, of course, is my all-time favorite, the summer 2016 password. I know people are in the audience laughing, but I've got in more times with this year than you would ever imagine. It's absolutely absurd. And it works every time with the season. Now we're rolling into winter, so hopefully we'll get some winter 2016s. But you know, it's almost as easy as enumerating the usernames from an application, summer 2016. Deployment misconfigurations. This is my favorite. Has anybody ever heard of NetBIOS spoofing? It's a pretty popular tool called Responder that does it. So hardly anything uses NetBIOS anymore, right? But it's difficult to turn off. It actually requires some effort, you know, manpower to go inside the environment and turn it off. And so most people don't want to do it. Its successor is what's called LLMNR poisoning, which is local link multicast name resolution. Once in Windows Vista, they introduced that to sort of take the place of NetBIOS as the Windows protocol. So it's absolutely fantastic. What it does is basically, you know, you set up a rogue server and it transfers your domain hashes across the environment. You know, it's a little more complicated than that, but I'm not going to get into it totally. But it's so easy to turn off. It's literally one GPO policy setting. Like, click, it's gone. You know, but we're not doing that. I've found that on every pen test that I've been on this year. In fact, it's so common that I just do that, and then I put it to the side, and I don't even use that to own the environment anymore, because I almost feel like it's cheating. LLMNR. You know, patching, we're getting a lot better at patching when it's Windows. The problem is all of our other stuff that's not Windows, right? Doesn't usually make it into the patch cycle. And I realize that that's not a lot of people's fault. I mean, like, when you look at, like, an Adobe patch cycle and you look at it and it's like, we fixed 5,642 bugs this year, you know, month or whatever, you're like, geez, like, so it's just crappy software. There's something you can do about it, but patching is still a really big issue. Another really big issue is that I don't see a lot of organizations running their own vulnerability scanners. This is getting a lot better, but these things are so cheap. I mean, like, Nessus is like $1,200 a year or something. I mean, like, it's literally absurd to not be running your own vulnerability scans at this point. And so, the reason that's important is because 9 times out of 10 in an organization, I find some low-hanging fruit, right? And if I come into the organization and I get in with one of these things that we just started talking about, that, like, did I even really need to be there? Did you even do your due diligence for the vulnerability scans? Did you even check for, you know, like, every scanner I know catches Tomcat, you know, Cold Fusion, all of that stuff lights up any vulnerability scanner. So where I'm going with that is, once again, like I've been saying, we've been using the same techniques, you know, the same methods, and they're user compromise, perimeter exploitation, and pivoting and post-exploitation. So the one thing that's become the most important to me to show customers is pivoting and post-exploitation. So this is what people really care about, or you should be caring about in an organization. There's always going to be a remote code execution, or there's always going to be, you know, somebody that didn't set the right password or something like that, right? Keeping up with that type of stuff is impossible. However, if you can limit the movement that somebody could do in an organization, you're doing way better than most people, right? So I like to tell people to think of it, you know, instead of the old school, like, castle wall effect, like, let's build our perimeter up as high as possible, is to look at it from a situation of, like, okay, I know at some point this computer is going to get compromised. It just is, because it just is. So what can I do to mitigate that user, computer, you know, whatever, from getting anywhere else in my network? So now I'm going to enter the blue team. So I feel really bad for the blue team guys. There's Mick. Let's give a shout out to blue team. So I feel really bad for the blue team guys. I really do. And the reason is because, number one, I get to blow in an organization. I usually don't have any rules. I get to do whatever I want, and I just run over the place, and I give them a report, and I'm like, all of this stuff is wrong, and then I bounce, right? And so that's how it used to be, and I really didn't feel like I was making a difference like a lot of those times. Like because I don't know, especially when I come back the next year and you have the same issues and I said it was critical and I'm like, why didn't this get fixed? And so what we did, at Trusted Sec was started to look back on like, what's our responsibility, right? I mean, it's easy for me to say, well, I gave you the report and you didn't fix it, so it's your fault, right? But is that really the case, right? So a lot of times we get hired to be like a trusted advisor, right? A lot of the companies are smaller and they don't have big security teams and they might not understand what NetBIOS spoofing is or the implications of turning it off or any of that kind of stuff. They might not know that, an encoded PowerShell command gets by basically, any execution policy or whatever. Some people just don't know that. And so not everybody can be offensive and, not everybody can be defensive, but there's not any reason why we can't work together. And so what it looks like most of the places after I leave, is this guy. And he's sitting at his desk with my report like, what am I going to do? I mean, like, I literally have to find one hole. I have all week to find one hole into an organization. And a good blue team has thousands upon thousands upon thousands of holes to keep up with. So it's not really fair, unless I'm helping that guy out, right? So that's where I'm going. We got a pretty big disconnect, right? And so what we've been doing is trying to extend our assessments a little bit more so that we can come in and we can help with the blue team activities, right? And so normally what that consists of is finding out what technologies they have in place. A lot of times, I don't want to diss on anybody's products, but I'm going to. But anyway, so, a lot of times I go to an organization and I finish the pen test and they're like, hey, why didn't our, why didn't our FireEye catch you? And I'll be like, you guys have FireEye? Like, oh. And so, and that's nothing against FireEye. Like, technologies are fine and they definitely have a place in the process. But what I've noticed is that a lot of times they're inconfigured properly. At my old company, we were a VAR, value-added reseller, and we, 90% of our business was selling product, and then there was the little consulting group that I worked in. And what I noticed over the years was that what would happen is you would get, like a $50,000 budget to buy like a firewall. I'm just making this up or whatever, and they would spend $47,500 on the firewall, and then they would only have like $2,000 left to have some poor B-level guy come out and configure it, rather than buying a piece of technology that was a little bit cheaper and actually spending the time to bring an expert in, make sure that it cohesively worked with the rest of your equipment and that kind of thing. And so I see that more times than not, where there's so many devices in a network and they're not working together, and the information is somewhere. That's another good point that comes up on these tests all of the time, is that there is a huge difference between what I really like is when they come into the room and they see me and they're like, oh my God, there's a pen tester here. And then they all run back to their computers and they start digging through Splunk and like whatever else, and down in the bottom, they find some anomaly and they're like, we caught you, and I'm like, look, there's a really big difference between, seeing me and, figuring out I was there after the fact. Right? And so, most places have logging in place, but it's such a massive information that you're not actually seeing anything. It's like, log all the things, well, that's fine, but if you're not alerting on any of that stuff, or if you don't know where to actually look for anomalies, then you're just wasting terabytes of space logging your stuff. So, one of the first things that we like to talk about on these assessments is, I love this term, it's my favorite. But, I used to make fun of it a whole lot, but it's actually true, right? So, basically, there's definitely some things that you can do as a blue team, that don't require you to be some super offensive red team lead ninja, right? Scanning, remediation, retesting. Going back to the vulnerability scanners, right? It's not that hard to scan for the vulnerabilities, go in there and, prioritize them in some fashion and, go in and validate them with some, third-party tool. I mean, half the times when we validate these standard findings, I mean, it's like with curl or some other Linux command line tool, right? It's not rocket scientist. It's definitely not black magic. Another really important thing that we see is sanctions versus rewards in companies. Like a lot of people, don't want to report security issues because they don't want to call the help desk and say, I just clicked on this link and it occurred to me that, it might not be that great. Nobody wants to be that person because they think they're going to get in trouble. But what I have seen work is, a rewards type program. Like, for example, every time we had a place I was at, they had just implemented a program where every time you reported a suspicious email or an attempted phishing attack or something like that, every week you would get entered into the drawing for like $100, Starbucks card or something like that or whatever. But the point is that it gave people a reason to actually like report stuff to that. Now granted, I bet there's a bunch of people that reported a bunch of nonsense so they could try to get the Starbucks card. However, I'd rather they reported too much stuff than none at all, right? So, and also third-party testing, right? I mean, third-party testing is important, and I don't mean to downplay that at all. I mean, we should still be doing our due diligence with, bug bounties, penetration tests, all of that kind of stuff. But the thing is that we need to take it a little bit farther because what we're currently doing is really not working all that good. One of the biggest questions that I ever get on this cyber hygiene stuff is, how do I know if my vulnerability management program is working, right? I've got so many vulnerabilities, like I can't even keep track of them, like they just keep getting unpatched, And one of the ways to find this out is, when you get tested, are they finding a different way in every single time, right? So the goal for me on the blue team side, when I bring in a penetration tester, I know they're going to get in at some point, right? There's something that they're going to do that's going to get them in. What I want it to be is something different than when they were here the last time because I fixed that the last time, right? And I want it to be something different. And more importantly, what I really want is I want to be able to see what they're doing, right? I want to be able to detect their activities. One of the other main things that we help people do on the blue team side is assessing their maturity model, right? And so, Dave Kennedy, the founder of our company and one of the guys that started DerbyCon with, he was instrumental in writing the penetration testing execution standard. Anybody ever heard of that? A couple people. What that is basically is a guideline. A whole lot of penetration testers got together, and we actually developed a standard that we wanted to follow for penetration tests, but more importantly for me, it's for our actual clients and the people that are buying penetration tests to go in and read, and it will tell you whether you got what you paid for, right? It will tell you what is it the law, fact, end all, be all? No. However, there's over 300 security, experts that got in on this and got together and decided that it was a good idea. So if you're on the side of buying these type of tests and you're not sure if you're getting what you're supposed to be getting, jump on over to the P-test and take a look through it and see. It goes over everything from discovery, pre-engagement interactions, all of that kind of stuff. Like, did that stuff happen, Or was it just, bang, I owned you, high five, I'm gone, Because, I don't know about you, but I'm not paying $50,000 for that. So then you got this guy, he's back. I got a sweet product, right? I'm not picking on anybody, but there are some products that claim they can solve 9.9% of your issues. But so this is the guy that we all want around, right? One of the cool things about my company is that we're vendor agnostic. We don't sell any products whatsoever. We're not sponsored by anybody or anything. Like when you ask me what products I like, the only feedback that I have is what gave me a really hard time on the last penetration test. That's really all I have. I don't own any of these products. I don't have a FireEye at home or, anything. All I know is that, the last, companies I've been at over the last year have implemented this way, and it, was a real pain. So, I want to talk about some more of the stuff. What have I learned so far on these purple team engagements, right? The main thing that I've learned is this, and my boss always says this all the time. The product industry has literally set us back. in security. It literally has set us back, probably at least 10 years. And the reason being is that we've been, it all goes back to the cash, right? So we're in these security positions, they're giving us all these people and they're giving us all this cash and we don't know what to do. And on this side, we have all of these product companies saying, I have a product that will fix your problem, right? And that's not to say that these products don't work. The problem is that I have yet to see a product that does everything, and I have yet to see a product that even does its full job completely without some type of smart person behind it. A perfect example, let's just say, like a logging mechanism like Splunk, right? So Splunk is fantastic. It's a fantastic tool. It logs everything, right? But if you don't have somebody that knows how to write a Splunk query, well, then it's basically useless. What are you going to do with it, right? So, we've been conditioned to rely on all of these products, right? And they give them fancy names, and they, I go to places all the time, and they're like, oh, you're going to have a really hard time because we got one of them next-gen firewalls. And I'm all like, oh, okay, how is that different than your previous firewall? They can't even tell me, right? They don't even know what the difference is or whatever. So, unfortunately, we're having a lot of problems with product. And so that's one of the reasons why one of the most important things when you do, I call this the death of traditional penetration testing, right? This is basically what I'm talking about here is that we need to, instead of, doing this covert adversary simulation, like under the radar, like all of this kind of stuff. Like that's what I used to think was the best thing. I used to think it was cool, like I slipped in, they didn't catch me, rappelled up the wall and all this kind of stuff. I used to think that was awesome. The problem is at the end of the day, I didn't feel like I helped the blue team protect against me the next time. So what works better for me is to go with more of an open approach, right? And so lots of people have talked about this whole purple team thing or whatever. So, but what that means, it means different stuff to different people. But what it means to me is that we come in together. I make friends with the blue team people. We come in and we talk about what technologies we have. We did a really big one at the beginning of this year, and it went really well. We went down, as a Fortune 500 company, we went down. And basically, they got us a whole conference room, and there were monitors all around the conference room, and we had the, the Splunk guy and the Carbon Black guy and the, whatever other stuff they had going on, the McAfee guy and everything. And every individual person basically put their product, up on the screen, or their technology that they were in charge of, and they put that up on the screen. And what we did as a red team was we had come down the week before and we had just done all of the attacks and made notes and all of that kind of stuff. And what we had done is we had constructed use cases that would show each of the attacks in action that we could do step by step for the people. Because the other thing that the blue team people don't always understand is if they're not working with us and they, they might see like a PowerShell something or other, in Splunk. But if they don't understand the attack process and how we go through the actual engagement and the things that make sense to us to do lateral movement, it's 10 times harder to protect against, right? We need to be totally transparent with how these attacks work. Because the stuff that we're doing as penetration testers is the exact same stuff that malware is doing out there, right? PowerShell, Mimikatz, like all of that kind of stuff, even past the hash when it still works. That's the same way that malware is replicating against the network. So basically here we got, I keep my gangster theme going. So basically we got, now we got a situation where the red and the blue team can work together and it's less adversarial. I don't know if anyone here is a penetration tester, but have you ever gone into an organization and sat down and everyone's, oh, there's the auditor, over there or whatever. They're like, stay away from the auditor, and so I never liked that. I always felt like they didn't want me there, you know what I mean? And I don't want to feel like that. I want to feel like I'm helping, maybe I'm soft, I don't know, whatever. But I want to feel like I'm actually helping, right? I don't want them to not like me. I want them, I don't want them to think that I'm there to cause them PCI issues or anything like that, because I'm not, right? The number one thing I tell people is, equations like this, gotta go out the window, right? I can't tell you how many times I've seen, this is obviously a joke, but it's serious. Like, people have stuff like this in their organizations where they're like, oh, well, the probability times the risk of, whatever. So, this type of stuff is absurd, right? There's no formula that protects against an attack. So what kind of stuff should we be spending our time on, right? So this is something that's, I probably should have made that bigger. That slide slipped through the editing process. So anyway, there's a lot of stuff that can be done in your organization, and it doesn't require buying a device. You know, it may, I'm not going to say it doesn't require money, because the stuff requires, you know, manpower, hours, you know, maybe bringing in experts, training, that kind of stuff. But I guarantee you that it doesn't involve a product that you don't already have. And so, number one, anyone that knows me knows I'm a huge fan of network segmentation. Who has a firewall? If you have a firewall, you can do network segmentation, right? It's literally like rules and text files. You just have to know what you're doing, obviously, right? I'm a big fan of network segmentation, and I'm a big fan of people getting the least privilege that you're supposed to. My favorite example is the HR department, right? Everybody's got an HR department, and so as a security, we hate HR because their whole entire job is to open up PDFs and Word documents all day. That's their whole job. So why would I want them in my environment, right? That's terrible. So perfect example is if you take my business units, right? You go to the HR department and you're like, look, what do these people really need, right? They need access to AD to authenticate, and they probably need access to some, you know, database thing that they enter in their HR information into. I don't know what it's called, but whatever. And so, you know, where they keep track of all their clients, but that's it. Like, what else do they need? Why do they need access to the server VLAN? Why do they need access to member servers? Why do they need access to the DMZ? They don't need any of that stuff, right? So you can cut them off. And there you've lowered your attack surface just by that way. So I'm a big fan of network segmentation based on business units, you know, with security zones. Education and awareness, you know, are you ever going to fix everybody? No. However, you can cut the attack surface down, right? So there's nothing wrong with doing education and awareness. There's plenty of companies that, you know, have training on this kind of thing. The one thing that I will recommend is especially on phishing education and user awareness. I've seen it not be as effective when a company comes in and puts a bunch of like Nigerian prince examples and stuff on the board or whatever. Like, that's not that effective. What I've seen be really effective is a company actually doing a phishing test and then coming in and following it up with a presentation, and then actually put the email that everybody, you know, was compromised by, you know, like on the board, like, hey, does everybody remember this? You know, and there's all these people like, oh, no, you know, like, but that makes it actually be ingrained in their head, right? It's real to them. It's no longer a, you know, 419 scam or, you know, joke or whatever. Like, it's actually real. So that type of stuff works a lot better. I'm gonna go on about monitoring and detection in a little bit, but you know, other things, secure coding practices and security integration throughout the lifecycle of a project. I can't tell you how many times, you know, we get a call from somebody that says, I've got a product, it's going to launch, what's the date? I got a product and it's going to launch on October 24th. It's a hard date, I can't change it, I have to have it pen tested before then, right? I mean, like, don't you think that you should have scheduled that before your hard product launch date, right? I mean, like, that's a perfect example of somebody not building security integration into the lifecycle of the project. It was an afterthought at the end, right? And so what if I get in there and I'm like, this is the worst SQL injection I've ever seen. I mean, you just have to start from, you know, from scratch on these 3 pages, right? I mean, like, you're never going to make your product launch. It's not going to happen. So that's why it's important to build in security integration from the beginning. Is it going to cost more to bring in some super smart security dude to oversee the project? Absolutely. But I guarantee you that it'll save you money in the long run because A, you won't get hacked, or B, you won't have to have multiple penetration tests on the product before it's launched. Another big problem that I see is the breach, right? So one of the biggest issues that I see in security departments is that they're reactive and they're not proactive, right? Basically, all they're doing is putting out fires all day long. And I actually blame this, you know, more on the business than the actual security department because, you know, there's IT and there's help desks and there's all these other kind of people to put out fires, right? Security should be proactive and focusing on these issues. So what happens is we have a breach. Everybody goes into panic mode. All of the fancy policies go out the window, and everybody's scrambling around and trying to figure out what they're going to do. And none of the security protocols that were put in place, actually work. And everybody wants to blame it on an APT, or it was China or whatever, and then what'll happen is they'll say it was a sophisticated threat, right? And that's what'll go in the news. But you know what? If you've ever looked at any of the malware that's on some of these breaches, yeah, some of it's like 10 lines of Python. Sophisticated. That's what they like to call it or whatever. I mean, like, does anybody remember the Sony breach? I mean, that code looked like it was written in 1985. I mean, it was absurd, right? I mean, but that was an APT, and it was, North Korea or whatever, you know what I mean? Like, getting around, getting over, like, a lot of this industry terminology that's, meant to make you scared, like advanced persistent threat or whatever, and actually looking at, like, what some of this stuff is, right? And so, a lot of the times, if you had some insight into your network, these 10 lines of Python would never get by you. I mean, like Mick over there, we could fix that in a few minutes, right? You'd never get that by. But, so the number one thing that I try to talk to people about is, what are you trying to protect, right? You would be really surprised how many times I go somewhere and I'm like, what's the most critical data in this organization? What would hurt the most if I actually had it? And unless it's a bank that says my money, a lot of people don't even know the answer. You know what I mean? And sometimes I don't know the answer. What's even more important is that you tell me the correct answer, because I can come into an organization and pretend like I know what your crown jewels are, but I don't know because I don't work there. Perfect example, I did an oil and gas place. Went down there and we wanted to do some goal-oriented pen testing, and so, they were going to give me some flags, and I said, what's the most critical piece of data in this organization? I'm assuming it's the customer list or whatever, but no, they actually had a database which contains survey plans from surveyors that they had purchased for potential new oil sites. Right? So that's obviously very important, whatever. But I would have never known that unless somebody actually told me. I would have never known that that was the most critical data. So knowing what you're trying to protect is probably the most important thing. And there's nothing wrong with getting out on a whiteboard and writing it on the, on the wall, like, first and second grade, and tackling the problems one at a time. The next thing I always like to talk about is you got to actually know what your adversaries are, right? Like, I got to be honest with you, like, China doesn't care about some of you people. I mean, they really don't, you know what I mean? Like, and so you can buy next-gen China protection or whatever they got going on, but I mean, like, a lot of times they don't care. That's not to say that you don't have adversaries and you don't have competition in the business and you don't have potential industrial espionage, because that stuff's real, right? It's happening all the time. But it's really, really important to actually know who's potentially attacking you and protecting against it. A lot of times I'll go into places and I'll be like, they'll be like, oh my God, we're so worried about China. And I'll be like, do you do any business with China? And they'll be like, no. And I'll be like, do you do any business with anybody in the Pacific Rim? And they'll be like, well, no, not really. We're a U.S. company. And I'll be like, hey, let's go over to the firewall and drop the whole Pacific Rim. Problem solved, right? I mean, like, some of the stuff is really, that's a funny example, but some of the stuff is super simple, right? I mean, like, and we're not doing some of the really simple stuff. One of my favorite things that Dave Kennedy did when he was at Diebold, he was the CISO at Diebold for a long time, and we did, my other company, we did some external penetration tests for him, and one of his big things was to cut down the noise, right? So a lot of times we're logging all this stuff and we got all this noise and we have no idea, but there's some really simple stuff that you can do. This is back to the firewall thing. Dave went back and he said, look, I need port 80, 443, 53 for DNS, and like 8080 for some random applications or something, right? He's like, I don't need anything else. He said, well, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to auto shun everybody else for 6 months, basically, right? And so, like, that cut down his noise. The scale of stuff that he had to look at after that was so small that it was actually like a digestible format that he could get in there and see an actual targeted attack that was happening. And so, we did an external penetration test against them, and I pulled out all the stops. I was doing NMAP with scanned away, fragmented packets, like the whole 9 yards, every evasion technique. I was doing, FTP relays and bounces and everything else. He still caught me. Still caught me because he had that small insight into his network. And so that leads into, we talk about 3 things like on our blue team that are really important, right? So detection is the first one. So there's no sense doing anything else until you can actually detect something, right? We're not even talking about blocking or any of that kind of stuff. We're talking about seeing. And that doesn't mean digging through your Splunk logs for 8 days until you find what I did. That means, did you get an email alert, or did you get, like a blinky product alert or whatever you got going on in the web interface, or did you get something that said, oh my God, R. Smith just tried to log into 100 boxes at one time. They weren't failed logins, they were successful because the attackers already have R. Smith's password, but I'm still going to alert on that because I know there's no chance that guy would be logging into 100 simultaneous boxes successfully in a 2-minute period, right? But is that something that we as attackers do? All the time. So basically, detection is probably the most important piece, and you can't get anywhere without detection, right? And so, but there's so much to detect. So what that means is that you need somebody like me to come in and say, this is how we attack your organization. And are we going to get every single vulnerability? No. So that's not the purpose of a penetration test. A vulnerability assessment, we use a scanner and we go wide and far and, with depth and all of that stuff for whatever. And we validate as much as we can and give an overall picture of the network, right? That's absolutely crucial and necessary in the beginning. But once you get past all of that and get your patch stuff under control and you start doing some real targeting, goal-oriented penetration testing, then I'm only going to show you, I might work on it for weeks, right? And we only might get one way in, right? But it's going to be a way from A to Z, the path of least resistance. Is going to show you all the ways that we made it through your network. And a lot of times, if I was to rate the vulnerabilities on their own, they might be mediums, they might not be critical, or they might be, some highs and some mediums. But once I chain all of those, I hate to use the word attack chain, but I'm going to anyway. And so once I chain all of those together or whatever, then it becomes a critical risk, right? Because I went from A to Z. The next thing that we're talking about is deflection, right? So the next thing we want to do is deflect some of the issues that we see. So a perfect example of this is PowerShell, right? I mean, PowerShell has now become the go-to tool for penetration testers, right? It's almost on every Windows system. We can run it in memory. We can bypass execution policies. We can do a lot of things. And the really neat part about it is that, while we can use some of our monitoring tools, like Carbon Black can see we can write a Carbon Black rule to see PowerShell execution in the environment. But we can also use PowerShell to turn off Carbon Black, right? So it's kind of a tricky situation or whatever. But but we were really successful with Carbon Black, actually. Carbon Black with Splunk in one environment that we went into, we were really successful with writing some rules for, creation of privileged accounts, PowerShell execution, that kind of thing. And so, something that's really simple in your environment is that we as pen testers always encode our PowerShell commands. That's how we get past the execution policy. Have you ever tried to run something on PowerShell and it says you've been restricted by the set execution policy or whatever? Well, when you run PowerShell and you encode the command, and you run it in memory, it just bypasses all that. It's fantastic. And so, but what had happened is, some of the products had caught up on that, and so we used to use the -encode command. So some of the products had started flagging on -encode. So, that was kind of a bummer for like a day, until we figured out that there's actually another shorter version of that command that is just -enc to encode as well, right? But they weren't flagging on that. So they weren't flagging on the actual encoded, they were flagging on the flag. So we just changed all of our tools to run that other code and we were all set, no problem. And so, it's a constant battle to keep up with that kind of stuff. And you almost always need somebody offensive, to keep up with that type of stuff. The next thing that we like to talk about is compensating controls, right? So people laugh, but there's all kinds of compensating controls that can be put in place. I mean, I'm running out of time. I'll talk about every single one, but basically, user account stuff getting more granular with user account stuff is one of the things that messes us up all the time. And I'll actually show you the registry setting that messes it up all the time. I like to make fun of this term too, risk appetite. I remember when people started saying it a couple of years ago, but after I made fun of it for a while, it's actually got a little bit of meaning to it, because, you know, when I was really young, like I, you know, like had this nirvana that, you know, a company could fix every problem if they would just, you know, do what I told them to or whatever. But the fact of the matter is that it's not like that, right? I mean, the primary goal of a company is to make money. Security is always going to be secondary. You know, the point for us is just to get that security as close to second as possible, because it's never going to be more important than making money. So at some point you have to go over, you know, what type of stuff is an acceptable risk, right? And so you do have to have some sort of risk appetite, right? And it goes back to where I was talking about, like, China doesn't care about some people, right? So like if you're in, you know, like some textile manufacturing organization, you know, like eyewear or something, like I don't think China's trying to get you. You know what I mean? Like you can have a little risk appetite on some of this stuff. Another one of the most important things we see in InfoSec today is people complaining, right? People like to complain about, you know, how bad something is or how bad, but there's not very many solutions. And so I like to be a solution officer. I don't like to complain. I mean, some of the stuff in the industry we're stuck with, you know what I mean? Like, and I'm not anti-product by any means. I mean, we've got plenty of products at Trusted Sec, you know, in place doing the things that they're supposed to. We just don't replace our people with products, right? We don't put all our eggs in one basket. So, you know, what I tell people is to get back to these basic principles, right? So the basic stuff is what messes me up the most on penetration tests. Like, you know, like FireEye or like, you know, Silence or any of that stuff. Like, I don't even, you know, it's like I rarely even see it. You know, that's not to say that those tools don't give you some endpoint visibility, but as attackers, they don't really cause us a ton of problems. So basically, you know, low-hanging fruit, that's the number one thing. Stuff that a vulnerability scanner can get, I shouldn't be finding when I'm on a penetration test. Keeping your security team proactive instead of reactive, I talked about this already. You know, that's actually like a life skill, right? I mean, like learning to be proactive instead of reactive. And so a lot of the security teams I see are reactive. They don't fix something until it's broken, right? And if they don't know that it needs to be fixed, that's not their fault. So that's one of the reasons that it's important for a red team person to come in and be like, hey, you can do this, this, and this. And they'll be like, oh my God, I never thought of that. And on the flip side, I'll learn when I'm sitting with the blue team because they're like, this is how we do this, this, and this. And I'm like, you know, thinking in my head, you know, that's really awesome. Now I can work on getting around that or whatever, right? So like, it ends up building up the relationship between the red and the blue team and making everybody smarter. So password policies, this is still like the worst thing in the world. Like I don't understand why in the days of all this technology and all these password managers that we're still using the default Windows password policy of 8 characters. I mean, it's totally absurd. Just to show you how absurd it is, it doesn't even cost any money to fix some of these problems, right? So we have a tool called Ships. Who knows about the local admin password reuse, right? Pass the hash attack. We've been talking about that for like 10 years, right? Well, that's still a thing, unfortunately. I still get pushback from companies all the time that are like, hey, we just use the same local admin password on our gold disk image. We push it out to everyone. And the argument, you know, against removing the account, I'll go into my next argument, which is removing the administrator account totally. But the argument is always, well, what if our CEO is in China and he can't log into the domain, you know, and he's used up all his hash attempts or whatever, and we've got to get into this computer some other way. I mean, that never happens. I mean, like, re-image it. I mean, like, there's so many other things you can do. So just an example, there's some tools that are really expensive, like, you know, like I'll pick on CyberArk. I'm probably going to be in trouble with all kinds of vendors later, but whatever. I'll pick on CyberArk. Like, it's a great, fantastic tool. It does awesome password management, does all this super cool stuff, but it costs a fortune. Like, I don't know, can anybody afford it? Because I can't. But so, in order to combat that, you know, Jeff Walton over at Trusted Sec, he wrote this tool. It's actually $3.99, and it's called Ships. And basically what it'll do is it will manage all of your local admin passwords and keep a separate one on every computer, keep them updated for you. It's totally free. Did I mention that part? So at this point, there's not really any excuse to have the same look. Like, I should not be using the pass the hash attack. I should be retiring those Metasploit modules, but I'm not. Some other easy mitigations that we can do, we talked about randomized admin accounts, also disabling the admin accounts, right? There are several systems where you can actually disable the admin accounts. Now, on some of the newer servers, you have to put in place another administrator account before you can disable the first admin account. However, it's still better to at least have the admin account named something different. Like, that's not to say that I'm not going to get it, but, it's something, right? It's, at least it's not administrator. And then, the use of privileged accounts in environments is totally random, right? So what I always harp on is getting really granular with user accounts, right? Tomcat's the one I always like to pick on all the time. More times than often, we get in on an application, and what was happening, the application will be running under the domain admin process, and the reason being is that some guy was trying to get his application to work. He was under a deadline to get his thing finished. And he couldn't get the application to do what it was supposed to do under a normal user account. He's trying to check all this crap in the GPO policy. It's about to be beer o'clock and he wants to go home. So he goes, you know what? I'll just make this thing a domain admin and call it a day. And press go and goes home. Well, next thing you know, I take over that application and I'm already a domain admin, right? So that's somebody that didn't take the time to get really granular with his account, and it's an easy win. Another really easy one is, a stout basic binaries, file types, and PowerShell. I mean, like, everybody's got, like, app blocker and stuff, right? I mean, that's pretty standard. I mean, like, you can stop a lot of this stuff with app blocker, right? And endpoint visibility. This is a big one, right? Probably, I don't even want to throw out a percentage, it might be wrong, but a high percentage of attacks start on your endpoints, right? It's a user clicking on something, and somebody got compromised, that kind of thing. So I'm not saying that endpoint tools aren't important, but because they are, but it's using the data that they give you, effectively, and not believing that your endpoint monitoring tool is going to stop all of the attacks. We're talking about detection, not deflection at this point. And then GPO policies. One of our favorite GPO policies is this one: deny access to this computer from the network. This thing messes me up all the time. And here's the setting right here. This messes me up more than anything on any pen test. I'll skip this slide. Whoops. And then more, I won't harp on this too much, but this is more on network segmentation, right? Isolate this stuff. There's no reason why I should be able to. Yes, Mick, do you have a question?
If you prevent from logging in from the network, how do you log into the system then? That GPO you have added slide.
Well, that's for the administrator account, for the local admin account. Sorry. So just to clarify, we're talking about the local administrator account here. So once again, isolate, right? There's no reason why this stuff should all be on the same network, right? I shouldn't be able to plug into a conference room and be able to reach the domain controller, right? This stuff seems really elementary, but it's not. Like, it's obviously hard, or people would be doing it. This is another one of my favorites. I always get the budget argument on this because I will say that red team consultants are in demand and have fairly good salaries and that type of thing, and a lot of times you can't make the case to hire one of those people internally, but I really, really, really think that it's a good idea. I feel like every company should have at least one internal offensive person that's all that they focus on is offensive attacks, right? Maybe that's some, nirvana that I got going on or whatever, but if at all possible, hire a red team pen tester. Back to the vendors, it's super, super important to actually research your vendor. I'm not going to, call anybody out, but there's a lot of bad pen test teams out there. Not bad, it's just that they're, like, what they're doing is more of a vulnerability scan and validate kind of thing. So knowing the difference, and if the maturity of your organization is a little bit lower, that might be what you need, at the time. But if you've got a group that's coming in, you've been doing pen testing for 5-6 years, you've been fixing all these issues, you're doing your due diligence, and they're coming in and giving you a report and it's full of blue lows and stuff, like, That's not the case, I promise. They're just, out of their skill set. They don't know what else to do. And so it's time to look, at a different organization so that you can try to find some new issues and that kind of stuff. Once again, going back to the P-test, I like to tell people to go to that penetration test and execution standard. Don't take my word for it. Take 300, 400, or however many people worked on that security expert's word for it on what a penetration test should look like, what you should get, what the results should be. I mean, at the end of the day, like, if I'm the CEO of the company and I'm looking at the budgeting and it says $100,000 for security testing, right? Like, I don't know what they did. I don't know if they sent Mick and he cost a lot of money or whatever. All I know is when you hand me that report, I paid $100,000 for it, so it better be good. I mean, like, and when I write a report, I keep that in mind, right? Like, this is all somebody's going to see. This is what they pay for. If I can't articulate what I did on this report, then, I didn't really do my job. Standard pen testing, it still makes sense. I mean, I'm not saying that we shouldn't do it. I love goal-oriented pen testing. It's my absolute favorite thing in the world. I don't like to go after domain admin. It's boring. I like to come into an organization and say, give me 10 flags. I like to ask for 5 technical flags and 5 business flags. You tell me what's important, and let me see if I can go after it, right? That's my favorite kind of testing. I don't like it when they give me IPs. I don't like it when they give me anything, because I like to follow the breadcrumbs in the organization, because that way I can show you realistically how I got from A to Z without any help whatsoever. Mergers and acquisitions, I always recommend a lot of testing there. You don't want to connect somebody's network to your own without at least knowing something that's going on. Have product launches. We do a lot of pen testing against products, like hardware type stuff, just to make sure that there's no, default telnet type stuff on there or whatever. Anyway. And so, basically, here's the things that I feel like you should get out of like a really good purple team assessment, is understanding the risks and threats and taking those back and to help design your networks and applications with the offensive part in mind, right? I mean, think how much cooler, I don't know who's an application developer, but if I was developing an application, I had Dave Kennedy over here and I had Mick over here, I bet my application would be a lot better when it came out of the wash, right? Now, did it cost me more to develop it? Probably. But if I figured that into my initial security budget, then it won't be as big of a deal. I talked about this a lot, understanding the process of attacks, right? I mean, me and Mick just did a blue team recently where he went out to the organization and we staged a whole bunch of attacks or whatever, and Mick showed me some cool stuff I didn't know. I showed Mick some cool stuff he didn't know, and we both learned from that exercise, and the client really learned from that exercise. This was a client that was used to getting security assessments from a Big 4 vendor. I'm not going to throw anybody under the bus, but so they weren't ready for us like at all. And
curb stomp.
Yeah, and the thing was that yes, it was a curb stomp. However, what they learned was that you get what you pay for. Like sometimes you don't want to go with a Big 4 company. Sometimes you want to go with somebody who's a little bit more on the offensive or a little bit more on the defense. And I'll be honest with you, I had a lot of painful conversations with them, but at the end of the day, like I really feel like we helped them. If I go into an organization and pen test all week long, and I work with the blue team and say they got, Carbon Black and Splunk and all this kind of stuff, and so they're alerting on, they're tracking event codes in Splunk, and then they're writing Carbon Black rules, based on certain event codes. If at the end of the day we created a rule to detect PowerShell, and we created a rule to, to track domain account creation. Interesting story, I was at a place one time, I'll get back to the other story, but I was in a place one time, and they were like, we got you, you'll never be able to create a domain admin account, which I don't normally do. We always run with a service account, but what we do is when they say we're tracking that, then we test them, right? So we'll create an account and see if that's real. So I go in there and I create an account, and everything's good. And I go over there and I'm like, cool, did you catch me? Let me see the alert, and they're madly looking through their Splunk, or whatever. And they're like, no, it's not there. Well, it turns out that they were alerting on the particular event code for the creation of a domain admin account. However, there's actually 4 different event codes based on the different kinds of creation of a domain admin account, right? If you create one from the GUI, it gives you one event code. If you use an incognito token, it's a different event code. If you do a net use command, it could potentially be a different event code, right? So just out of that, they wrote 3, 4, 5 new Sprunk rules, you know, and at the end of the day, they're like, we got our money's worth. Well, in this other situation with Carbon Black, you know, if I help you write 3 rules at the, like, I feel like I really help the organization. Like, if at the end of a 1-week pen test, we can detect encoded PowerShell usage on your network, like, that's a good week, right? That's a lot better than getting a, you know, long list of remediations that, you know, you don't understand or are generic or don't make sense or, you know, like whatever, don't apply to your organization. You got to have 8 follow-up calls with me to even figure out what I'm talking about. When you just could have had us in there with the blue team, totally transparent, you know, step by step and cutting out the middleman. So one of the other things that, you know, we always like to do is show what a motivated attacker can do with these weaknesses, right? We like to give, you know, proof. And a lot of times when everybody's sitting in the same room together, there's a lot more shock value in executing the attack from A to Z in front of somebody. All right, so thanks everybody for coming out. I don't want to run over the time or whatever. I will take questions if anybody has any questions.